I'm glad they're all three included.
And I want to invite all of you to remain after this wonderful program to stay for our adult education presentations on, well, it's a discussion, stories for the sake of argument. And of course, I left the book back with Rita. Rita, can you wave the book around? So the point of this short program with the rabbi leading it, thank goodness, is to how to have healthy arguments or discussions without listening, right? And the other thing that I'm up here to encourage everyone to do, please see me after this program or whatever, Marcia Cox, I'm in the book, The Temple. So recruiting for a lovely gardening group to help keep our little native garden in the courtyard active without and growing without too much stress on all of us. And then hopefully we'll be joining in with the Jewish Coalition on Environmental and Jewish Life event. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcia Cox. And thank you, Mitchell, for the information about Windsor Artisan. We are getting into the tail end of our Ryterband program. If you notice coming in the front door, there's a big poster of the rest of our Ryterband sessions with pictures and so forth. And also, if you looked at your Temple tablet that I just got, then the next 4 are mentioned. And a week from today, Neil Gittleman will be here and he will talk on music that matters. But today, we have a special guest that we invite every year. Unfortunately, he always has something interesting to talk about. Marshall Weiss is here, and I believe everybody knows him. So what I've asked Marshall to do is let us know something about him that nobody knows, including his son Levi, who's sitting right here. So without further ado, Marshall, welcome, and we look forward to your presentation.
Oh, thank you. So, by the way, this is my son Levi. Levi's my technical advisor. I'm not sure, honestly, if this is one he does know or not, but I think he might not. First of all, I want to make sure that the sound is down on this, so I'm gonna rely on my friend Levi here to watch me do this. No, that's not the one. Sorry. Yeah. I literally could not do this without Levi. Who I just call Mr. Levi because he's a teacher, and that's what a lot of the kids call it. So go back to the presentation now. There we go. All right, something that nobody knows about me. This could be a whole lecture unto itself. So my first venture in communications when I was a junior in college, I was an intern in Washington, D.C. in 1988, when people didn't laugh when you said you were an intern in Washington, D.C. So my internship was with the National Headquarters of Public Broadcast, PBS, in Alexandria, Virginia, great place. And my singular job was to answer all the viewer mail that came in. You can only imagine the volume. So there were 2 things that stood out in answering the viewer mail. One was, there was a documentary in 1988 on PBS hosted by Ronald Reagan's son, Ron Reagan. And this was kind of the height of the AIDS epidemic. And on PBS, the president's son was demonstrating how they put on a condom with a banana. And I had to answer all the negative viewer mail that came in from that, including from the, I think it was like the Banana Growers Association office in America, from South America. And the other one that came in, I mean, obviously these were not to me, these were to PBS, but came to me, It was the 20th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King. PBS had done a documentary on the 20th anniversary of the assassination. And I get a letter, open it up, and it says they didn't quite get everything right in the documentary, and then went into some detail about what they didn't get right. And I see on the front of the envelope, it's stamped, this letter is from a federal penitentiary, and at the bottom, it's signed J.E. Ray, James Earl Ray.
Ooh.
So I took that letter to my boss, who took it to her boss, took it to his boss, who took it to the head of the company. And I can only imagine what that letter would maybe go for on eBay or something. I don't know. Anyway, so those are two, do you know that?
Yeah.
Oh, so it's nothing juicy or salacious, but I am so happy to be with you today. We're not gonna live in the past, no one should live in the past, but it's nice to visit once in a while. And at least for the next hour or so, we can kind of take our minds off the present and look back at Temple Israel, which is 175 years old this year. So what I've tried to do here, rather than dates and names and dates, is really to try to find some flavor, some of, okay, what was going on? What were people like? What were some of the things that they were doing back in those days? A big challenge to our understanding of Temple's history is the same challenge that so many organizations have in this town. Much of that history was washed away in 1913 in the Great Flood. There's very little when it comes to primary materials pre-1913. Temple Israel was downtown. Piecing it together has been a little bit of a challenge. There are archives down in Cincinnati, the American Jewish Archives, that have been very helpful. A wonderful source has been the newspaper, The American Israelite, which started out in 1854 in Cincinnati, basically as the national magazine of the Reform movement. And it was common for all the congregations that aligned themselves with the Reform movement to send in updates of what was going on in their congregation. So we've got that too. We rely on that pretty heavily. We can take down the lights a bit if somebody can take it down. Okay, thank you. So I thought it was appropriate, since this is a PowerPoint presentation, to begin with a magic lantern slide. This is from Dayton Public Library. And you can see this is what Main Street looked like here in Dayton in the 1840s, which is pretty much when our story begins. There may have been Jews who came through Dayton before 1840. And by the way, can you all hear me all right? You can hear me? Okay. But they didn't seem to really settle here until the 1840s. And these are Jews who came from the German states. It certainly wasn't just Jews. A lot of Germans were coming to the United States between roughly 1815 and the 1880s in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, after the Napoleonic Wars. And there were very limited opportunities, tough economic situations, internal strife, lots of Civil War kind of things going on in the German states. Particularly in the southern German states, like Bavaria, there was a little bit more anti-Semitism toward the Jews than some of the other states, in terms of professions Jews could be involved with, places they could live. Very few Jews could get married in a given year in Bavaria. So that's one of the reasons that in that period, 1815 to 1880, about 200,000 German Jews came to the United States. And that's when Jews start showing up here in Dayton in the 1840s. Here's another view. This is 1851, downtown Dayton. This is a view that would have been familiar to anybody who had just arrived in Dayton. You can see the newly completed courthouse over there on your left. You can also see cattle just kind of roaming around Main Street. You can also see, if you look toward your right, telegraph wires. we're downtown. If this is looking north on Main Street, you see where Third Street is in the courthouse. If you were to go all the way straight up Main Street to Water Street, that's where you would see the Miami River, and eventually that would be kind of an embarkment place for the canal that was running through here. So it wasn't a one-horse town, but it was probably close to a one-horse town.
What was the population at that point, roughly?
I think the population was probably about 2,000. Don't hold me to that. I'm gonna have to, not of the Jews, of the whole community, but yeah, I don't know exactly, but I'm thinking it was about 2,000.
They would build a courthouse like that for
Isn't
2,000?
that impressive? Well, keep in mind it's for the whole county also, for the county. So. This is the first leader of the Jewish community in Dayton. This is Joseph Lebensberger. And what we're looking at is a bust from Riverview Cemetery over his grave. Lebensberger was born in Bavaria in 1812. He marries a nice girl in Cincinnati in 1846, and he arrives in Dayton that year and goes into men's furnishings. And it was Lebensberger who brought together, give or take, the word is about a dozen, it might have been fewer than that, a dozen Jewish men in 1850 to form what was first called the Dayton Hebrew Society. This is where they first met. I think you've got this picture on your wall walking in here. This was the first bank in Dayton was in this building. And I think it was generally known as the Dayton Bank Building. The Hebrew Society met on the second floor. They sat on wooden benches for prayer. They used a pine wardrobe as an ark for the Torah. One of their first pioneering members, a man named Abraham Wendell, was their prayer leader. We also know that he probably was the shochet. He also slaughtered meat to make it kosher. And we know that because he shows up about a decade later in Piqua, and there's an argument about the congregation thinks that they're paying too high a price for kosher meat, so they fire him, and they decide they're gonna somehow make kosher meat on their own. This, I don't expect anybody to read it or to be able to read it, but this is the deed to the first Jewish cemetery here in the Dayton area. And this was 1 year in, this was a year later when Joseph Lebensberger purchases a very small tract of land. It's Brown Street, Rubicon, I'll find it, the other street, the other cross street. So this is, I love just the calligraphy of this, but we'll zoom in so that you can see there's not much precision when it comes to the exact acreage. If you go down to the third line, it says containing 1 acre more or less. That was as particular as they got. And Lebensberger bought it from a woman named Dietrich on behalf of the Hebrew Society. This is what the cemetery looked like before the bodies were removed in 1967 and brought over to Riverview Cemetery to what's now the Founders section. And you can see what happened was NCR basically grew up on all sides around the cemetery. And John Patterson wanted that land because it was right in the middle of NCR. And that's a story that kind of goes on for years and years. Patterson's efforts and NCR's efforts to purchase that land and for the bodies to be removed. So I will show you from the Sanborn Insurance map, in yellow, that's where the cemetery is. So Stewart Street, Rubicon Street, and Brown, it's right there. I'll zero in on that so you can get a little closer view. At this point, NCR is pretty much all around it. Where the cemetery was is now the rear parking lot for Flanagan's Pub. And what I do know is that there were some remains that were just not able to be removed from there in '67. It was just too far gone. So underneath that parking lot, there are still some remains. The first person to be buried at the cemetery, I believe her remains are still there. It was a 7-year-old girl. Her name was Belinda Friedrich. Her family was from Piqua. There was no Jewish synagogue or cemetery in Piqua yet. She was the first one buried there, 1852. So the story goes, when they were trying to remove the remains, everything it just disintegrated, whatever was there. So, okay, this I believe you also got on your wall. This comes from a notice in the American Israelite from Joseph Lebensberger about what's going on here. 1854 is the year that this entity formally incorporates as a congregation. So this is where Lebensberger talks about the reside few Jewish families. We organized a congregation about 4 years ago. That's how we know 1850. And the congregation's original name, KKB, probably should have been a Y, although they could have said I. So Kehillat Kodesh, Holy Congregation, is the KK. It was B'nai, now the rabbi's gonna have to help me with this. Is it Yeshurun or Yeshurun?
Yeshurun.
B'nai Yeshurun, which roughly translates to righteous children or children of righteousness.
And by the way, you should know that every high holidays, there's a reading in our prayer book that has Yeshurun in it. We always read it. See
Makes
if everyone
sense,
can pay
makes sense.
attention to it. That's your extra credit for the year.
So I don't know if it was a typo or if they would have gone Yeshurun with an I or what it was. But here we know for a fact it lays out the founders. Philip Cohn, Joseph Lebensberger, Henry Herman, Abraham Ash, Adam Leopold, Eschab, M. Wertheimer, Abraham, should be Wendell, not Wendler. He was the guy with the show head also. Elias Schoensberger. What I can extrapolate from this congregation's history was that in the early years, nobody really thought about documenting the history of the congregation. What we have in the records, and I've been through the records here, in the next generation, the oldest members of the congregation tried from their memory to relate what happened with their parents. So in the next generation, you see additional names of founders listed who aren't necessarily among the founders, but maybe they thought they were, maybe their memories failed, maybe they wish their parents were the founders. So what I found on the whole and really digging into the history of our Jewish community is that you can't trust any organization's history of itself fully because people don't remember things correctly, people get it wrong. Some people, I wish I had a nickel for every person who said, my grandfather founded this thing or that thing or that thing, and sometimes they're right, but not all the time. Okay, so this is 1854. This was a scandal involving a cemetery that I just found. Okay, gossip, rumor, innuendo, always part of any community. Reports being circulated that the president of the congregation of B'nai Yeshurun, in connection with the board of trustees of the city, take advantage of non-members, charging for the interment of a deceased $25. Can you believe it? Hence, the title of the above congregation to the burial ground located within the city limits was not valid. The undersigned in the name of that congregation declared those reports as untrue and malicious, and spread abroad by the agent of an opponent of the congregation. Said congregation never charged more than $10, and now charges no more than $5 for the interment of the deceased. This is the part I find interesting. It seems that they actually had a name for this cemetery. The lawful title to said Beth Chaim was transferred to the congregation as soon as chartered by the undersigned, that would be Lebensberger and his wife, who bought it for the congregation. So apparently, this cemetery appears to have had the name of Beth Chaim, House of Life. Who knew? I only just found that out this week. I went back in to kind of check these things out. but scandal even back in the day of overcharging for the cemetery. Okay, this is a picture of two of the original congregants for B'nai Yeshurun. This is a picture of Abraham Loeb and Teresa Myers. This was sent to me by descendants of theirs. This photo is 1880. They married in Dayton in 1854, and they were among the first members of the congregation in 1854 when it was officially chartered as a congregation. He came from Bavaria. She, I think, came from somewhere in Germany. Now, did they look this way because they were Orthodox Jews? Probably not. They probably looked this way because this was the 1880s. Okay. This is 1858, and B'nai Yeshurun starts a benevolent society to take care of those Jews in need in its community. Meeting was held in 1858. Blah, blah, resolved, we Israelites of the city deem it proper for our own protection, etc. Benevolent society. What I find interesting here is one of the people who signs it, who's at this point a member of B'nai Yeshurun, is Henry Flesh. Who is Henry Flesh? Eventually, he's going to move up to Piqua, and he's going to become a very, very, very prominent businessman up there. I think he's going to be one of the people who opens a bank up there. His son, Leo Flesh, will at some point abandon Judaism and open knitting mills. He's going to open up the Atlas Underwear Factory and basically become like the underwear king of the United States. That's where you may have heard over the years that Piqua was the underwear capital of the United States, and that was because of Atlas Underwear. And you may have also heard of the children's series Captain Underpants, which was, it's written by Dave Pilkey, who is from Piqua, who always throws little Jewish references in there. But deep irony of having the name Flesh and being in the underwear business, everything in Piqua is named Flesh this, Flesh that. With the advent of the internet, an unfortunate situation came about. When people would do searches for the Flesh Library in Piqua, things would come up that they did not expect to see. So the Flesh Library had to change its name to the Piqua Public Library, regrettably. This I love. Okay. This was in 1859 in the Israelite. This was seeking someone to do all the ritual functions of the congregation. Wanted the congregation of B'nai Yeshurun, at this time with the J, wants a chazan, shochet, and teacher, cantor, kosher slaughterer, a teacher in one person, in the Hebrew and German languages. German was also one of the important languages spoken B'nai Yeshurun. I believe the sermons at this point were still in German. This is 1859. A salary of $350 will be given besides prerequisites, which will amount to blah, 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 blah. Joseph Lebensberger. What I found was every year, probably for the next 25 years, this ad would run in the Israelite almost every week. Almost every week. It would go up to $500. By the 1870s, it's like $1,100. But long story short, it was hard to find somebody to run the functions of a congregation in those days. It's not so easy today. It was very difficult. And I believe it was between 1860s and 1880s, there were so many prayer leaders coming and going because they had trouble finding the right person. Oftentimes, the people they would hire would claim to have the correct rabbinic ordination from Europe. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. But they came and went. This is where things get exciting. So this, I'm sure you recognize this image from the wall out in the hallway. So this was the first synagogue building in Dayton, B'nai Yeshurun's first building. They did not build it. It was a Baptist church that I believe the building dates back to the 1840s. But this was a very exciting time, not just for the Jewish community, but the general community. It seems from the newspaper accounts that the Jews of Dayton, pretty small group, maybe 30 or 40 families, were very well accepted and respected in the Dayton community. I've got a little bit of a dispatch here coming up from the Dayton Journal. 1863, by the way, this is the middle of the Civil War. And in March, I think it was May of 1863, the Dayton Journal was burned to the ground by Democrats who were very, very unhappy with their coverage of what was going on. To tell you what was going on in Dayton. So the Dayton Journal reports, and it's also covered in the Democratic press, the Dayton Empire. So this is something that no matter where you are on the Civil War, the media is covering. The city council was there, a large number of pretty girls dressed in white, marching in couples, young ladies charmingly costumed, exquisitely decked with headdresses and scarves succeeded them. Prominent members of the Yeshurun bearing 3 scrolls containing the law covered with the richest velvet cloth with crowns and decoration followed under a canopy. There's a significance to 3 Torah scrolls. It's what you need for a congregation to function comfortably at certain times of the year. You read from 3 Torahs. So these guys have arrived. They've got what they need. The velvet Torah coverings, I think there were donors in Cincinnati who provided those. It wasn't uncommon for synagogues to ask for donations from other synagogues around the country, if not the world, to help them out. We're very fortunate also that we have an account from Isaac Mayer Weiss of the dedication. The dedication of any synagogue in this area of the country was of great importance to Weiss, who really was the architect of Reform Judaism in the United States. He is originally from Bohemia. After some time in upstate New York, he settles in Cincinnati in 1854, starts his newspaper, The Israelite. He is going to found the seminary, Hebrew Union College. He is going to pull together the Union of American Hebrew Congregations as an umbrella. His goal is to really kind of create a new modern Judaism for America, hoping that reform is the way people will go. And it's very exciting to him to come to Dayton, which is just up the road by train, it's not hard to get to be part of the dedication, and he is part of the dedication. And I'll just read a little excerpt of what he tells us in 1863. He talks about the ceremony itself and the architecture. He talks about it's renovated with a fine shrine and pulpit decorated in a splendid style. The sacred shrine, that would be the ark, well finished. The window above it bears the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments in painted glass. There are no galleries in the building so that men and women will sit on one floor. What we don't have any images of the interior of this building. I have never seen an interior image of this building or of Temple's next building. And I still hope that someday something will come out of somebody's attic so we can see what it looked like. But for now, we can only guess. So after the dedication, there's a party. And the party is at this place. This is called Beckles Hall. It's actually a German theater on Jefferson between 3rd and 4th, not too far from the new building, which is at 5th and Jefferson. The Dayton Journal tells us that it was a brilliant party, giant cake surrounded by flowers. The mayor and prominent citizens were there, but what really to me is most interesting is the party lasted until daybreak. I mean, we know of any synagogue parties other than maybe Shavuot that last until daybreak. So they kind of knew how to party. Because this is in the middle of the Civil War, I thought I'd also veer off and just share with you the stories of some of the Civil War veterans that we know about. There aren't that many Jewish Civil War veterans here in Dayton, but this is an account of one of them. And this is a newspaper clipping from, I believe, the 1920s. where very little was known about this particular veteran. And whoever wrote this for the newspaper, I believe this was in the Journal, makes a big to-do. It's on Memorial Day, and he is going to honor this veteran at his grave, and put a flag at his grave. And it says little is known about this veteran, and they give us all they know. And at this point already, this is not an active cemetery. The original cemetery, I think the last burial is about 1889, when the new cemetery, Riverview, comes into place. There's a caregiver, but he's waxing poetic about how he's not going to get any visitors, this person, but whoever wrote this article is the one who placed the flag at his grave. He is now part of the Founders Circle, Simon Oberdorfer, Civil War veteran. This, you can see his grave, and then the older headstones that are placed kind of together. So, and this was all moved over there in 1967. What can I tell you about him? He was a private in the 34th Regiment in Kentucky Infantry. He enlisted at Louisville in 1862 at age 21. He had been a tailor, he had been a waiter. His family came from Baden. His father was a butcher. He was raised in Louisville. This is what's left today of his headstone, just the top of it. And you can barely read what it says. He went to work as an orderly, and then apparently he suffered from a really bad hernia. So he was then sent to work at the telegraph office in Cumberland Gap, discharged at the end of the war, and then he spent his last years at Dayton Soldiers Home, which was one of the VA homes in those days that was here in Dayton. That's now, the modern VA. Dies in 1877. Now, the other guy that we know of, this is a picture of him from his passing later in life. This is Isaac Pollock. And Isaac Pollock arrived here in 1850 from France. He and his partner in business, Saul Rau, another old name for Temple Israel, from Bavaria, they started selling wholesale liquors in 1858. They became very successful in the wholesale liquor business. In 1862, Pollock is appointed a corporal with the Squirrel Hunters. Have any of you heard of the Squirrel Hunters? Okay. Squirrel Hunters, they were civilians who assisted the federal government in defending Cincinnati from Confederate attacks and possible invasion. So there's a legitimate concern that the Confederates are going to invade the North by way of Cincinnati. In concert with the federal government, the governor of Ohio calls for all able-bodied men to come to Cincinnati. And fortunately, because of that, nothing happened. So on one hand, it was a success, nothing happened. On the other hand, nobody can really claim any kind of gallantry or valorous acts. But I think for the rest of his life, after he attained that rank of corporal, I think he might have gone by corporal. There's some press accounts where they just call him corporal, because this to him was a big deal. These are our men. That's Pollock on the left, Rau on the right. And they were very involved with the general community, besides being involved with B'nai Yeshurun, be sure. You never get that right. Pollock was a major donor to St. Elizabeth's when it was established. Rau was a director of Merchants National Bank, besides them being in the wholesale whiskey business. Here's an ad of theirs from 1859 in the Dayton Empire. They were good personal friends. Their families married in with each other. This is a picture from later than their period. You can tell by the electric street lamp there. But they were so well off. 1876, they built identical mansions for their families next to each other, 319 to 321 West 3rd Street. According to legend, I can't verify it, but it's a great story, in the shade of a nearby tree, they flipped a coin to decide which family would occupy which house. Already, this is about 2 generations later. One of the houses, I can't remember which, is now a school for the dance, the BOTT, B-O-T-T, School for the Dance. Dancing was a big craze in the turn of the century, 19 teens, 1920s. A lot of Jewish people learned to dance there too. The other one was the Board of Elections House. Now, the Pollock House still stands, but in a different place. In 1979, it was moved to 208 West Monument, where it still is. For several years, it was the Peace Museum. So now it's a private residence, and it's been restored, but it's still around. Now, so about 1893, Pollock splits from Rao. And this seems to have been because Rao decides to get into the actual distilling business. And it seems that Pollock just wants to do what they've been doing, the whiskey wholesale business. So now Rao and Sons turns to distilling. And this is a back of bar decanter for Rao's whiskey that sold on eBay a few years ago. I wish I'd bought it. But, so this would have been, you go to the bar, and back behind the bar, this would have been where they would have poured the whiskey from. Now, the flood devastates the Rao and Sons building at 107 East Elm Street, destroyed. I believe the fire is really what does it in after the flood. In the area that's called the fire blocks. They rebuilt at this site. But I know that they were distilling whiskey at least until the flood. They might have been doing it afterwards. Then comes Prohibition, and that's a whole other story. So we'll leave that for another time. I have a talk on Dayton's Jews and Dayton's booze, and we'll go into that soon. Okay. Now we're just going to go back a little bit. So it's 1869, and someone, calling him or herself Hammer, maybe because of McAfee or Maccabi, gives an update on KKBY that they are now using Minchag America, which is the Reform Prayer Book adopted by Isaac Mayer Weiss. So they're leaning into the Reform movement, which is very close by down the road. This is kind of a big thing. This is kind of their first official statement that we're going Reform. Here's a wedding invitation I found at the American Jewish Archives. The couple, Sarah Weiss and Adolf Nusal. This is in 1870 at a private home. So many weddings were in private homes then. I love the way the time is listed at 7:30. I think we need to go back to that. Reverend Dr. Lethal, I believe, was a rabbi based in Cincinnati, not in Dayton. What I love about this is there's a little bow that's tied on the invitation, and it's still intact. Really cute. He is from Russia. I'm not sure where she's from. They come to the US in 1860. They're in Dayton in 1867. And they become very successful jewelers in town, very prominent, successful jewelers. Here are cameo portraits of them from later on in life, when they're established. And they too, their business is pretty much destroyed in the flood. If the big building on the left, you can see this white-looking awning in the middle, that's New Salt Jewelry. They were also able to rebuild, but they were, you can see the damage when the floodwaters reside. What it looked like. Okay, we're gonna go back a little bit again. 1875 in the Israelite. And I think this is on your wall also. Temple Israel is, Yeshurun, is again announcing its further association in the Reform movement. So the B'nai Yeshurun, formerly a strictly Orthodox congregation, we know they adopted Minhag America. They're talking about now a choir and organ, and this choir would have been men and women together. Sabbath school has been organized with over 100 pupils and ladies and gentlemen as teachers, so we're egalitarian to some extent. The congregation is in a prosperous condition under the leadership of et cetera, Reverend Mr. Fisher was recently elected minister, looking good, et cetera. The congregation will be represented at the union. So 2 years previous, 1873, is when the Union of American Hebrew Congregations is established, comes together. This is where Mayor Weiss pulls in congregations to officially associate with the Reform movement. This is their official statement that we are Reformed, and we are part of this union. For years, I wondered if the congregations who were charter members, and this congregation is a charter member, that is, they joined in 1873, if the charter members would have been the ones that were in closer proximity to Cincinnati, as opposed to those farther away. And the answer is yeah, for the most part, the charters were those that were able to have a much closer personal relationship with Weiss, who could easily hop on a train and visit these congregations. Not in every case, but the very first charter member, Evansville, Indiana, obviously Cincinnati, Indianapolis. This congregation is the fourth charter member. Dayton. Next is Springfield, Youngstown, Cincinnati, Little Rock, Louisville, Memphis, Detroit, Nashville. There are a few in here that are a little farther removed. Charleston, South Carolina, Beth Elohim, which I think was the first congregation to be reformed in this country, predating Weiss. But for the most part, they are in this area. There's that tangible connection to Isaac Mayer Weiss. So Fisher, Ephraim Fisher, was rabbi here in 1875. And this is Rabbi Fisher, and this is Mrs. Fisher. Please forgive me, I cannot remember her first name. I'm guessing the beard was because this was 1875. May have been more than that, but I don't think so. So yeah, there were 10 religious leaders between 1850 and 1889 here. Most of them lasted a year or two. Fisher lasted the longest, from 1875 to 1881, 6 years. Doesn't seem like a lot, but this was the person who was here the longest. And there is an account in here of Fisher leading a confirmation for Temple Israel. This is from the American Israelite. A large number of children were confirmed at the synagogue in the Jewish faith last Saturday. Ceremonies were conducted by Fisher, who, as instructor of the young candidates, deserves special praise for his proficiency, evinced by the young folks in their rigid examination. Apparently, they would ask these kids questions in front of the whole congregation. The kids would have to answer them at their confirmation. And they're so happy with Fisher, the congregation gives him a gift of an easy chair and a handsome pair of slippers. That's nice. I also found that the first confirmation at Temple Israel was in 1865. And it was, I believe, 7 students, most of them were girls. So, also 1869, this congregation forms a literary and benevolent society. The explanation behind this is great. The young folks of the Jewish faith in this city have made a step forward toward morality and the preservation of that high standard of virtue, which should characterize those who desire to be recognized as true descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. It is a fact, and we say it with sorrow, that the standard of morals hitherto existing among our people in this city has not been what it should have been. And this censure applies not to either old or young separately, but to both. So this is somebody from this congregation calling out Dayton's Jews for what seems to be moral depravity. I mean, I don't think he gives any specific examples, but there appears to be too much of an inclination on the part of our brethren to visit places which, if not absolutely bad, are at least of questionable reputation, and there pass their time in amusement. So that's why they're forming the Literary and Benevolent Society. I really want to know what it was they were up to. I don't think we're going to find it. So let us go to one more person in the history of this congregation. Anybody at all recognize who this natty young gentleman is? And he's looking really, really stylish for the 1870s. So this is the most important caterer in US Jewish history. Prussian born, this is Gustav Lindemann, known as Gus. He comes to Cincinnati in the 1870s, and he gets himself a reputation as probably the best, most celebrated caterer in Cincinnati, not just for Jewish customers, but for the general community. He's got a great reputation. So it's the first ordination of rabbinic students at Hebrew Union College in 1883. It's the 10-year anniversary of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. Isaac Mayer Weiss he invites all the leaders, all the congregation, lay and clergy from around the country to attend this momentous occasion at, first of all, the beautiful Plum Street Temple in Cincinnati, and then afterwards for a celebration up in Mount Adams. And his hope is really to unite all of American Jewry together. He seems even willing to compromise maybe the purity of Reform Judaism to be able to bring people together. This is his high hope. And our friend Gus Lindemann is hired to cater the banquet. And here is the famous menu from what is now known as the Treifa banquet. Treifa means not kosher. But usually when you hear Treifa, it's like really not kosher. It's like implied. It's a beautiful little invitation. They got an original at the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. Not very big, but it's got this beautiful dyed plumage all around it. And it was held at the Highland House, which I think might still exist in some form on Mount Adams. It might be like a coffee house now. So after the ceremonies at Plum Street, they took basically a cable car up to Mount Adams for this reception. And the menu, first of all, you get the sense that they're trying to prove, number one, that Cincinnati is not a backwater, because the menu is in French, albeit really bad French, just not grammatically correct French. But if you look at the menu, it's every possible kind of trait except for wine. Can you see that? Like, what's missing from this menu is there's no pork. Okay? So this was kind of the line in the sand. The Jews of Cincinnati tended to eat anything and everything, but their line in the sand, even as Reformed Jews was, they wouldn't touch pork. How do we know this? Gus Lindemann catered the opening of a beautiful, beautiful German Jewish private society called the Alameda Club in Cincinnati. I think it was the late 1870s. And there's an account in the newspaper of the menu, and basically it's this menu. It's like, what do you see there? Soft shell crabs and what else is there? Sweetbreads, yum yum. Pigeons, little neck clams. It's everything you can imagine, but there's no pork. And I guess in their minds, that's the line. So the big question to history is, how does this happen? How does this happen? Nobody knows for sure, because there's nothing that says, I did this and this is what happened. At first, Weiss is saying this was a mistake on the part of a committee. In his American Israelite, in a German language publication for women, he says it was the caterer. Jonathan Sarna, who's probably one of the greatest historians of American Jewish history, in the end, his belief is that this was a mistake. It was a mistake. However, Weiss was not the type to say, gee, we made a mistake, I'm sorry. So he digs his heels in. And if anything, champions tossing the kashrut principles of Judaism, deriding them as kitchen Judaism. 2 years later, Reform rabbis come together in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh platform, which officially talks about, well, we don't adhere to these laws anymore. They are not significant to us. They resonated with the ancient. But this basically causes a rift. these leaders go back to their communities, and those who are more in the Orthodox or traditional camp, they don't want anything to do with this. And they're writing about it in the Jewish press and in the general press. And the person who founds Hadassah later on, a generation later, Henrietta Soul, she's the daughter of a rabbi from Baltimore, and she's writing in the Jewish press about this incident. So while it may not have been such a big, horrible thing in Cincinnati, around the country, it's like, surely this thing is known. So basically, this is kind of the prime event that leads to the formal establishment of those who aren't Reformed, which would be Orthodox and conservative. In those days, the terms were interchangeable, basically. And then from there, the Orthodox kind of separated out from the conservative. So would these movements have kind of happened on their own? They probably would have. But it's kind of like the Wright brothers. Would somebody have invented the airplane if they didn't? Yeah, somebody else would have. But this is how it happened. So anyway, there's nothing to indicate that anything negative happens to Gus at all in his career. But in 1895, he moves to Dayton. He comes up here and he becomes the steward of the Dayton City Club, which is a private club here, not Jewish necessarily, but just a really hip, cool private club. Then he opens his own restaurant in one of the storefronts at the Victoria Theater. Here are some ads from his restaurant. And there are some ads that have one sale, scallops, oyster, things like that. He's also affected by the flood. 1913, Victoria Theater is flooded. After that, he becomes the steward and manager of the Dayton Country Club, and then just caters out of his own home until his old age. Here's Gus in his later years with his wife, Henrietta. Dies in 1927, ripe old age. But his contributions to history in Dayton don't end there. First of all, he's also buried at Riverview. So you can see the world's most caterer in the Jewish world at Riverview. But his daughter marries a guy named Joe Schwartz, Schwarz. And their daughters are these two. Right, Hermine on the left, the taller one, Joe on the right, who would go on to found their own dance school, and then the Dayton Experimental Dance Company, which would become the Dayton Ballet, second oldest ballet company in the country. Did anybody here study with either of these two? You did. Who did you study with?
I think it was Josephine.
Yeah.
But I mean, it was kindergarten. There were a number of Jewish girls and.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wow, that's so cool. And they also kind of played a key behind the scenes role in helping Dayton Contemporary Dance Company get off the ground.
I did with Joe
Yeah.
at the Linden Center.
Right. Right. That's a marvelous story. Mothers from the African American community on Dayton's west side wanted their daughters to be able to learn to dance too. And the Schwartz sisters, they said, if the girl, we'd love to teach them. If they come to our school, we're going to get shut down. We're going to come to you. So on Saturdays, they would teach, they would teach the girls on the west side. And that's kind of like the very, very origins of Dayton Contemporary Dance Company. So that's where it started. So he's in an indirect way responsible for the Schwartz sisters. Okay, we're going to slide back in time a little bit here. We're going to go to 1889, which is the year that Temple Israel buys the land for its current cemetery, which is Riverview Cemetery. I don't know about you guys, but even when there are no leaves on the trees, I can't see the river from Riverview Cemetery. Apparently there was a time you could. You know, the river has been redirected and rerouted, plus the canal which ran through there, which now is, I guess, the moat around what used to be Old River NCR. But here's a picture that someone from Oakwood Historical Society sent to me. Already, this is the canal had been, I believe, abandoned, but you can still see above the canal some gravestones from Riverview Cemetery. So just to kind of prove that you could see a body of water from up there. And I will close up in here so you can see the stones up there. So this is 1889. Simply put, the congregation ran out of space at its 1 acre more or less down on Brown Street. They needed more land. They bought this land. It was actually tough. It wasn't so easy to get to even in 1889 because the Far Hills, it's a hill. You're not driving. Most people would take, there was a traction line that went to the top of the hill from downtown, basically a cable car. And then to get up what now is called Shawns Avenue, and I think then it was called Cincinnati Pike, it had not yet been graded, so it was a killer of an angle. It was really tough to get up there. So we're just gonna slide to a few years ahead now. This is 1892, and this is B'nai Yeshurun, I know, I'm just gonna say Temple of Israel's second building. What's significant about this is the first synagogue building in Dayton that is built as a synagogue, specifically for the Jewish community to specification. And this is on the east side of Jefferson between First and Second. Just a point of interest for a little later in our talk, if you look to the very left of the building, see there's a building next to it, there's a little alleyway down there that's gonna be of significance to us later. We have no images of the inside of this building either that I know of. I hope someday we can find some from somebody's attic because the description that Weiss gives, it's 29 years later. Rabbi Weiss comes up for the dedication of this synagogue. He's an older man. The Reform movement has absolutely arrived. And he gives a description of the inside, and I'd like to share a little of that because we just have nothing else to go off of. So we are now in 1892. He talks about the auditorium, it's dished, which I guess means it slopes down. Seats 318 people. There's a gallery in this synagogue, wasn't before. The gallery on the east side is occupied by the organ and choir. Speaker's platform is in front of and below the organ loft. The ark to the rear of the speaker is slightly recessed under the organ loft. The entire finish of this room is of quartered white oak, excepting the pulpit and ark, which are finished in ivory and gold. Glass and decorations take their key from the woodwork, and the general color effect of the interior is soft gold and amber, very bright and pleasing. A rich glass dome of 50 feet in circumference forms the central feature of the ceiling through which light steals softly from the windows above. I wish I could see this. It must have been gorgeous. I've got a few more views of this building because that's all we've got. When Temple Israel makes the move to Salem Avenue in 1927, they sold this building. The owner, I believe, in 1929, they tear this building down. And I'm pretty sure at first it was a parking lot. I can only imagine what the stained glass windows must have looked like. What would have happened to those stained glass windows? I can't imagine. I mean, we can only guess. But this is where John Patterson, our NCR guy, kind of comes into the story. There are all kinds of legends locally about Patterson and the Jews, most of which are not true, and they start out with John Patterson hated the Jews, and this is how he tried to get in their way, and there's no truth in any of that. Certainly he was a man of his time, some ways ahead of his time, but he wanted that cemetery land that was surrounded by NCR buildings. So what he does with his brother Frank, they buy the cemetery, that old cemetery, in 1890. They're not telling anyone to remove the bodies, they just buy it. That's all they do. They also buy the original Temple Israel building, the one that goes back to 1863, to sweeten the pot. So the Temple Israel has the money to build and buy the land and build a new building. So he's really kind of becoming a good friend to them. in helping them with what they want, so eventually he can get what he wants. The old building, the old Temple Israel building, he uses as a showroom for NCR and as a training school for NCR employees and their spouses, not training for NCR, but just vocational training to better themselves, to better their lives, things that are going to help them socially. Here is a shot of, this is not my photo, this is one of those online guys, I think his name is Hirschner. You can see where Temple Israel was, second building, in relation to Steele High School, which is that castle-looking building up front. Steele High School was, before Steele High School was there, that was where the Dayton Bank building was, where the congregants first met to pray in 1850. So you can see they've been downtown all this time. They haven't moved all that far away. And then I believe this tall building way up in the back, up there, that's roughly the spot where the 1863 building was. Another shot of the building. Another shot of the building. Can you tell I'm obsessed with this building? I really am. So another thing that comes out of Temple Israel is a social club. So what we're looking at here, this was Temple Israel members, the Standard Club. It wasn't officially part of this congregation. It was a social and literary society made up of German Jews. Just like Cincinnati had their Alamania Club, we had our Standard Club. And the name Standard Club was kind of a euphemism that Jews used for their social clubs in a lot of cities. It wasn't specific to Dayton. The club actually started in 1883. It moved right to, in 1896 to this building, which was at the southwest corner of First and Jefferson, so it was very near the new Temple building. And roughly in this time period, they started referring to the building as the Temple, the Jefferson Street Temple. Among the founders of this were Round Pollock, our whiskey guys. There were 50 families, and this was a place for cotillions, banquets, musical and theatrical programs. When you had out-of-town guests staying with you, you would take them there for dinner and for programs. They had an in-house cook, a caterer. Eventually, this kind of a social club just falls out of fashion and style, and they gradually kind of shrink, and it devolves into basically a card club, just people playing cards at a rented room at the Gibbons Hotel. It basically kind of fades into obscurity, closes in 1925 at the same time as Meadowbrook opens up. Basically what takes the place of these downtown social clubs is golf. There's a golf craze in the United States, like in the 19-teens and 1920s, and the Jews want in on it. Yes, Patterson has opened his public golf course and everybody is welcome there theoretically, including the Jews. But still, people who have made it want their own private clubs, and the Jews are excluded from that. So essentially, the Standard Club fades out. The same people who founded, and their families who founded the Standard Club, they're the ones who found Meadowbrook originally. Okay, here's a very natty looking guy. This is the first rabbi at Temple who was ordained in the United States. He was ordained at Hebrew Union College. This is Max Wertheimer, German born. He graduates Hebrew Union College. He's ordained in 1889, and he's with the congregation for 10 years until 1899. Extremely bright. There was another interesting character in this congregation. I haven't really done much on him. Leonard Spialter, who was the head of the Genealogy Society years ago, had really done a deep dive on him. His name was Chaim Hyams. I don't know if you've ever heard of that name. Chaim Hyams was a British Jew, and he invented the gas meter. Because of Chaim Hyams, Parliament in England was able to meet at night because they had gas that was metered, et cetera, et cetera. Why does he come to Dayton, Ohio? I think his daughter and her family are here, but Chaim Hyams documents that one of the few people who has just this brilliant intellect that he can converse with is this rabbi, Rabbi Max Wertheimer. Wertheimer goes through a spiritual crisis. His wife dies. And he has really built bridges with a lot of Christian clergy in town. He has spent a lot of time with them. And it's possible he might have spent maybe a little too much time, because in his spiritual crisis, this is the rabbi who becomes a Christian Scientist in 1899. And a little later on, he switches to become a Baptist. And how he is known today, he wrote about his conversion. And that's the word that I want to use, when you explain when you convert. Anyway, that's been put into a pamphlet that's been distributed for generations. You can find that writing about how a rabbi found Christ online. To this day, there are Messianic and Jews for Jesus organizations that will quote that. Here's one from the Temple Israel Files. You can see the front and back of the brochure. How a rabbi found peace from the American Messianic Fellowship. The Messianic movement has been attempting to convert Jews to Christianity since like 1890s, 1880s. It's nothing new. What most interests me about this brochure is whoever filed a copy of it away wrote at the very top, "Mine was Seuss as a missionary." I don't know if that's the person who gave them this brochure or not. So Rabbi Wertheimer and this congregation go their own ways. But this is the start of an amazing period. Okay. This is Hebrew Union College's rabbinic class of 1900. And in 1899, this congregation had a rabbinic intern who was dynamite, who becomes the next rabbi of this congregation for 20 years. One of the most remarkable, exceptional people to be connected to this congregation. I'll close in here so you can see. This is our guy. Very, very natty looking, handsome young man. And this is David Lefkowitz, Rabbi David Lefkowitz. He's got a great story. I admit I'm a bit of a fanboy of his. And next I've got a magic lantern slide of him as he looked when he was the rabbi here. I guess he shaved off the mustache, and this is pretty much how he looked. Just looks like, I mean, if you were doing a casting call for somebody to play a handsome young clergyman. So his story is just amazing. He's born, I think, 1873 or 1875 in Hungary. The mother brings him and the other brother to America. The father, forgive me, he either dies before they leave, during the trip, right after. In any case, the mother gets to America. She can't support the boys. She puts them in the Jewish orphanage in New York. I think it was called the Hebrew Orphanage Society. It was run and funded by German Jews, prominent Reformed Jews. And at this society, not only do they care for the kids' needs and teach them vocational skills, but they really imbue and indoctrinate these kids with the values of Reformed Judaism, the moral imperatives, the prophetic vision. He becomes a rabbi. He comes to Cincinnati. He studies at UC. He goes through the program at Hebrew Union College. He is really the last class to be ordained to have that direct touch with Rabbi Weiss. Weiss dies, I think, in March of that year. They were ordained, I think, in May or June. He doesn't make an ordination, but the impact that they have from Weiss is palpable. I know the family told me that Weiss had gifted him a Havdalah set, which the family to this day still has. So this was kind of that last group of people to really kind of learn at Weiss's feet. He comes out here, and basically he found everything in this community that has to do with social justice, social progress, not just in the Jewish community, but in the general community. You know, for one thing, he starts the Jewish Federation to care for Eastern European Jews who started coming through here, you know, beginning in the 1880s. He is the first head of the Red Cross. He is, if there's no social justice organization in Dayton, that doesn't feel his impact. And we'll get to that a little later. So his papers are in American Jewish Archives, at least through his time in Dayton. After Dayton, he went to Dallas, Texas, and I think the second half is out there. This is a little sheet. It gives us an idea of the sermons that he would be delivering, the kind of topics that he addressed in those days. And this is a little tiny sheet of paper. This is 1909, 1910, and he's talking about our 10th year together. So, because he'd started as an intern. Are the Jews disintegrating? Some of these topics apply today. He's talking about the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the group of reformed rabbis, passing on our heritage, present dangers of assimilation, and this is specifically related to Hanukkah, the training of immortals, treasures of the passing year, true charity for others, Egyptian slavery, the eternal question, and the rest of it. Babylon capture, something in the temple, sanctification, dramatic, and Spanish Inquisition, the ghetto. I mean, you get the idea of the topics that he's talking about. This is the only image that I have of the area where the temples, the German Jewish community lived. This was a fancy pants neighborhood. It was on Roberts Boulevard, and this is the German Jews were able to live on North Robert Boulevard. You can see it looks like a domestic who's taking a kid out for a walk in the park. Robert Boulevard, there was a family of developers named Roberts, and they designed a boulevard that went all along the contour of the Miami River. So it went along the river all around Dayton. Where the Jews were able to live was North Robert Boulevard, kind of close to where Sinclair is today. And everything, of course, changed with the flood. But that was the place to live back in the day. By the way, what I did forget to mention was when this temple did draw its line in the sand to become formed, really 1875 was when they announced that they were having mixed seating and mixed choir together, and that they had adopted Minhag America, et cetera, et cetera. 1875 was the year that 3 people in Dayton who were Jewish, who decided they didn't want to be Reformed, started Beth Jacob Congregation that year, 1875. They were not Eastern European Jews. There were very few Eastern European Jews here until the 1880s. These were Central European Jews, French, German, basically the same immigration stock that had already come through, but they wanted to be Orthodox. So first thing they do is buy land for a cemetery, and then they start renting rooms, basically, which is what Temple Israel had done before that. This guy right here, in many ways, he was in league with Rabbi Lefkowitz. This is Ferdinand, although I think he was called Fred Ash, A-C-H. And he was the president here for several years when Rabbi Lefkowitz was the rabbi. He is in the coffee roasting business. Really cool. I mean, how can you not love somebody who's in the coffee roasting business? So he joins the Canby Company, which was a coffee roaster in Dayton, when he's 16 years old in 1877. 10 years later, he's a partner in the company. And here is a coffee can. This is a 30-pound can from the Canby Ash and Canby Company, fancy roasted bulk coffee. He was the first president of the Federation. Really, Lefkowitz is kind of the guy who put it all together, but he didn't want to be the head of it. He kind of was more behind the scenes. Ash and Lefkowitz were very active with the American Red Cross as well. So this was kind of his partner in crime. We are going to skip this part here. I'll have to come back sometime. This young man is Sidney Cusworm, another social justice giant. He's a lawyer who, in very short order, at a young age, he becomes a leader of the National B'nai B'rith. So from the time he's a young guy, until almost when he dies in the 1960s. He's the treasurer of B'nai B'rith on the national level. He's very active with Americanism. He rents his office in a vaudeville house in the Keith Theater, which comes up in the 1920s. And because of that, he gets clients in show business. He becomes very good friends with Sophie Tucker, with Eddie Cantor. In the 1940s, late 40s, early 50s, he's in Washington once a month because he's treasurer of B'nai B'rith, and every time he's in Washington, he's playing cards with Truman at the White House. This is where the arrow is. That's our friend Lefkowitz with the people who are running the Red Cross. Lefkowitz in 1920 decides it's time to leave. Oops. And we're gonna, I think, end here. The congregation begs him not to. They don't want him to leave. They love him. They love what he's doing for the congregation, but already after 20 years, it's time. He goes on to Dallas, and in Dallas, his big challenge there is the same challenge for the next rabbi here, kind of publicly standing down the Klan. So I think that's about as far as we're gonna go today with our history. So we go, give or take 100 years ago. We've got through what, about 7 years of history? And I'll just leave it for questions, whoever has any questions.
Questions?
Questions, anybody have any questions? Yes.
I'll tell you the trick on the kids answering the questions in front of the whole congregation at their confirmation. What I was taught in a Lutheran congregation is if you know the answer, you raise your right hand, and if you don't know the answer, you raise your left hand.
Well, that might have been the trick back in the day. Anything else, gang?
I'm curious about, and you touched on it, the Riverview Cemetery across from NCR. And I guess I didn't realize that that was a canal between those properties.
Yeah.
But I also thought that there was a train that you could take to get to that area and then either go up a walk or something to go to the cemetery. Were you aware of that?
Yeah, that was, so there was from downtown Dayton, it was a cable car, or I think they would have called it a traction line that you would have taken up Far Hills, and it ended at the top of that hill, which is just before you get to what's now Schanz Avenue. I think it ended where Patterson's home was, right in that area. And then once they leveled out that street, it wasn't so terrible, but at first, from the traction line to the cemetery must have been awful. So
Yeah, I understood that that was one of the main transportation lines to go visit the cemetery.
yeah. And the people who had it really tough, of course, so Beth Abraham Cemetery is right next door to Riverview, makes sense, 1894. The ones who had it the toughest was Beth Jacob. The land they bought for their cemetery, the closest they could find was up on, it's
Troy
the
Pike.
Pike.
Troy Pike.
Old Troy Pike.
Old Troy Pike, from a woman who, she was a widow, she couldn't manage the farm. And when they bought this piece of land from her, a very small piece, there was a stipulation that it was to be used as a cemetery and for nothing else. In other words, we don't want alive Jews there, we just want a cemetery. But this would have been a day's trip out and back for a funeral in those days. You know, if you're just thinking about by horse and wagon, it was not easy to get out there and back in the early days. So they had it tough. Yes?
Just a-
Yeah.
Let's let it go first.
You mentioned an alleyway behind the building that would be.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that. I ran out of time because I was getting so excited deep diving into this early stuff. I'll have to do another talk, but what I didn't get into was a serial killer some of you may know that story. A guy named Brian Forshner, who was he's a like great nephew of one of the victims, Mary Forshner. He wrote a book about 10 years ago. There had been a string of rape murders in Dayton in the first decade of the 1900s. And his theory is that it was the same person, that it was a serial killer. Back in those days, the police and the newspaper reporters were never able to kind of pick up on the pattern. And very quickly, two things. One of the victims' bodies, not Jewish, had been found in a cistern in that alley next to the temple building. There was a Jewish victim. They were members of Beth Jacob, and after that murder, I think that was 1907, these stories went around the world. This was, thousands of people came to her funeral, this was covered around the world, but in that time period, no one ever connected the dots to put the pattern together. Why is he convinced that it was a serial killer? The name of the book, by the way, is Cold Serial, Serial, IAL. The Jack the Strangler case his name's Brian Forshner. What happens is, it's 1910, the janitor at Temple Israel, who was also the janitor at the Candy Coffee Company, remember Ash is president of Temple Israel, etc. He is caught, he rapes a woman from Springfield at knife point in the rabbi's study. And she somehow escapes and they find her on the streets. They catch him because he's known, he admits to it. When he's put away, the string of rape murders ends. So that's why Forshner is convinced that this was the guy who had done it all along, got away with it. But that's a whole talk unto itself. So there's the end. Thank you for remembering that. I just didn't get to it today. Yes.
I just have one quick question. Why did the congregation that started out as strictly Orthodox make that change to Reform? Do we have any idea what the thinking was?
A lot of it has to do with what was already going on in Germany. Really, I mean, the roots for Reform Judaism go back to Germany in the 1820s. This was already going on. Jews in German lands, to some extent, had experienced the Enlightenment. Now, Germany was not Germany unified until 1871. Before that, you're talking about 30-some principalities, states, etc. And when Napoleon blows through there, he opens the gates, the Jews can leave the ghettos, theoretically they are equal and free with others. So maybe not all Jews, but a lot of Jews are now experiencing modernity, they're experiencing secular liberal education, they're to an extent experiencing equality. After Napoleon, each of these individual states, principalities, some of them were rolling back freedoms on Jews, some of them were suffering from economic issues, some of them are civil wars. There's a lot of weird stuff going on, but Jews have had a taste of this already. And some of these members of the European clergy, like Weiss, they've experienced this to some extent. And the German Jews who were just getting a taste of being equals in German society, that they really wanted to kind of be like everybody else. I also didn't get to talk about the affinities between Germans in Dayton and the German Jews in Dayton. There were some pretty surprisingly strong connections in the early days. There were Jews who sang with Liederkranz Society because that was the culture they embraced. Lefkowitz, the rabbi here, he gave a lecture, I think in the 19-teens, where 1,000 people showed up, and he's talking about German art and culture. His wife, I think, gives a concert of German songs, so there was some of that going on. And beyond that, I refer you to Rabbi Karen, who has the rest of the story. But it just, it obviously made sense to a lot of people, but not to everyone.
So, Marshall, I confess to loving your deep dive.
Well, thank you.
So are we booking you for the next 2 years or the next 3 years?
I don't know, you tell me.
To bring us up to
I can do
somewhere
the
close.
mass murders, I can do Jews and booze, I can just keep going. Whatever you want.
You know, so here at Temple, and Rabbi Karen can talk about this much more, or I think we're in the initial planning to the 180th anniversary. So maybe the idea is that you come back the next 5 years to get us to that point and maybe incorporate it into that presentation itself.
Sure. And you guys know I'll be happy to help you with your history.
Any other questions? Thank you, Mark. Very interesting. Thank you.
Yes.